For more than 3 centuries, one of the smallest countries in Europe controlled one of the largest populations in Asia. From 1602 to 1945, the Dutch ruled the Indonesian archipelago. 17,000 islands stretched across the equator, rich with nutmeg, cloves, coffee, and gold. But unlike other European empires, the Dutch didn't leave behind their language. Today, after 350 years of colonization, less than 1% of Indonesians speak Dutch fluently. How can a nation rule for that long and leave almost nothing linguistic behind? To understand that paradox, we have to go back to the beginning, to the world's first true corporation. In 1602, a group of Dutch merchants formed the Verenigde Oostindische Company, or VOC, the Dutch East India Company. It wasn't a government, it was a business, and its mission wasn't to civilize, convert, or educate. It was to dominate trade. The VOC had the power to sign treaties, build armies, and wage wars, all in the name of profit. It became the richest private company in history, worth more than Apple or Amazon at their peak. But behind the polished maps and golden coins was something darker: violence disguised as commerce. In 1621, the Dutch massacred nearly the entire population of the Banda Islands. Tens of thousands killed or enslaved, simply to secure a monopoly on nutmeg. Villages were burned, survivors deported, and the land repopulated with imported slaves and indentured workers. The message was clear: resistance meant extinction. And yet, despite their control, the Dutch never tried to make Indonesians Dutch. They didn't build schools for the masses. They didn't spread their language or culture. They ruled from a distance, through intermediaries, native sultans, and traders loyal to the company. This was empire as machinery, cold, efficient, and impersonal. The British built their empire through language and law, the French through culture and ideology. The Dutch built theirs through contracts and cargo ships. They didn't need people to think like them. They just needed them to work for them. So, while Europe's other colonies absorbed their rulers' languages, Indonesia was ruled by silence. A corporate empire that wanted obedience, not identity. Profit, not partnership. Control without communication. And that decision, the choice to rule without connection, would echo across centuries, shaping the birth of the Indonesian nation itself. In the 1600s, the world ran on spices. Nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon were worth more than gold, not for taste, but for preservation, medicine, and the illusion of luxury. Europe's growing middle class craved flavor, and the tiny islands of the Indonesian archipelago held a monopoly on it. To the Dutch, these islands weren't nations, they were assets, and the VOC treated them as such. The Dutch East India Company built a vast trade network stretching from Java to the Cape of Good Hope. But it wasn't exploration that fueled it, it was exploitation. Private armies enforced monopolies, and local populations were coerced into cultivation systems that served only Dutch interests. Wherever spices grew, Dutch soldiers followed. The Banda Islands were the first example. A paradise turned into a plantation. After slaughtering the local people, the VOC imported enslaved labor from India, Africa, and other islands. They called it business. History calls it empire. The Dutch made no effort to integrate the archipelago. There was no attempt at cultural unity, no drive to convert or educate, and certainly no attempt to spread their language beyond the elite. The language of the colony was money, and the only words that mattered were those written on contracts. This approach made the Dutch Empire unique. The British colonized mines as well as land, exporting language, law, and ideology. The French exported identity, insisting that their colonies learn to think French. But the Dutch exported only extraction. In Java, they established Batavia, now Jakarta, a walled city built by forced labor. Inside lived the Dutch administrators, merchants, and their mixed-race families. Outside, Millions of Indonesians worked plantations and docks, forbidden from entering the city's European quarters. The empire functioned like a machine with two classes, those who counted the coins and those who produced them. It was not an empire of faith or civilization. It was an empire of accounting. The ledgers of the VOC recorded every spice, every slave, every ship. They also recorded their own hypocrisy. The company that claimed to bring order and progress while enslaving entire islands for trade efficiency. By the 1700s, the VOC controlled much of the Indian Ocean's commerce, but the cost was human beyond measure. Millions worked under coercion. Countless more died under the weight of forced systems. Still, the Dutch language never spread, because the Dutch never cared to share it. The goal wasn't to build a colony that could speak, it was to build a colony that could obey. And in that silence, the seeds of something powerful began to grow. Resentment, unity, and the slow realization that language, not guns, would one day break the empire's hold. How do you control 17,000 islands without uniting them? The Dutch found the answer. You don't unite, you divide. Unlike the British or French, who used language and education to integrate their colonies into a larger imperial identity, the Dutch relied on fragmentation. Their power came not from conversion, but from control. A network of alliances, contracts, and local rulers bound by economics and fear. They called it indirect rule. Rather than govern the islands directly, the Dutch partnered with regional sultans, princes, and warlords, turning them into administrators of their own subjugation. Local leaders collected taxes, supplied crops, and enforced order, while Dutch officials sat safely behind their walls in Batavia. The result was a colony run by intermediaries, Indonesian faces carrying out Dutch demands. And that distance wasn't accidental. The fewer people who spoke Dutch, the fewer who could challenge it. For centuries, Dutch was the language of command, spoken only by soldiers, governors, and a handful of privileged locals trained for clerical work. The majority of Indonesians lived and died without ever hearing it spoken aloud. In schools, Dutch authorities limited literacy and restricted education to the elite. Missionaries and reformers who tried to teach the masses were often silenced or expelled. To the Dutch, knowledge was a privilege, and language was power. A report from 1910 admitted it openly. It is not desirable that the native becomes too educated, for he will no longer be content to labor. The goal was to produce workers, not thinkers. Translators, not leaders. Subjects, not citizens. This policy of engineered ignorance created one of the most effective control systems in colonial history. Each island spoke its own dialect. Each region trusted its own rulers. No shared language meant no shared rebellion. And yet, it also created something unexpected: the slow birth of a shared resentment. When an empire silences its subjects long enough, the silence itself becomes a form of communication. In the absence of a common tongue, Indonesians began to find one. Through trade, through labor, through whispered songs and shared hardship, a simple, accessible version of Malay started to emerge as the unofficial bridge between islands. It wasn't Dutch. It wasn't imposed. It was chosen. And it spread like wildfire, quietly, organically, beneath the empire's feet. While the Dutch ruled through division, they accidentally planted the seed of unity. And in time, that seed would grow into the very language that would destroy their control. Empires can control land, they can command armies, but they cannot control what people whisper to each other in their own language. While the Dutch imposed silence from above, something remarkable was happening below. Across the plantations, docks, and marketplaces of the archipelago, workers from hundreds of islands needed a way to communicate. And they found it not in Dutch, but in a simplified, flexible version of Malay. Malay had long been the language of trade in Southeast Asia. Practical, neutral, and easy to learn. Merchants used it to barter. Sailors used it to navigate. It wasn't tied to any single ethnic group, and it carried no baggage of domination. And in the silence left by Dutch colonial policy, Bahasa Melayu began to evolve into something new. Bahasa Indonesia, the people's language. The irony is striking. The Dutch, who feared education, created the very conditions that made education necessary. Their own refusal to teach or unify forced Indonesians to find unity themselves. By the early 1900s, a small but growing movement of Indonesian intellectuals, teachers, journalists, activists, began to imagine a nation that had never existed before. One people, one flag, one voice. In 1928, this idea found form in what became known as the Youth Pledge, Sumpah Pemuda. One nation, Indonesia. One people, the Indonesian people. One language, Bahasa Indonesia. It was revolutionary. A people colonized for centuries had chosen their own language, not their colonizers, as the symbol of unity. Bahasa Indonesia was intentionally simple. It used everyday words, borrowed from trade, and avoided elitism. It was built for inclusion, not hierarchy. It didn't belong to Java, or Sumatra, or Sulawesi. It belonged to everyone. And perhaps most importantly, it wasn't born from conquest, it was born from resistance. While other colonies adopted the language of their rulers as a mark of modernity, Indonesia did the opposite. They defined modernity as liberation, and language became their revolution's quiet weapon. When the Dutch tried to reclaim the archipelago after World War II, they discovered something extraordinary. The people they once ruled no longer needed translators. They spoke to each other in a single, shared voice, one that carried no trace of their former masters. Bahasa Indonesia wasn't just a language. It was a declaration that unity could be built without empire, and identity could exist without imitation. The Dutch had built an empire of trade. Indonesia had built a nation of words. For nearly 2 centuries, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the Dutch East India Company, ruled the Indonesian archipelago like a corporate kingdom. It had its own army, its own navy, and its own laws. Its ships carried not just spices, but silver, silk, coffee, and human lives. But by the late 1700s, the same greed that built it began to destroy it. The VOC's officials were drowning in corruption. Local governors inflated contracts, captains skimmed profits, and directors back in Amsterdam treated the company like a personal treasury. The cost of maintaining forts, garrisons, and fleets soared, and yet the exploitation only deepened. In Java, peasants were forced to grow crops they could no longer eat. Famine followed profit. Villages starved while warehouses overflowed. When the company finally went bankrupt in 1799, the Dutch state stepped in and took over its colonies directly. The empire was no longer a private enterprise. It was now a nation's lifeline. The Dutch crown inherited both the riches and the moral rot. In the 19th century, the Netherlands depended on its colony to survive. 1/3 of its national budget came from what it called the Cultivation System, a new state-run form of forced labor. Farmers were required to devote 1/5 of their land to export crops: coffee, sugar, indigo, and tobacco. The Dutch called it efficiency. Indonesians called it slavery with paperwork. Under this system, millions of Javanese peasants toiled endlessly, while Dutch coffers swelled. Back in Europe, the Netherlands experienced what historians call its golden age of prosperity. But it was a prosperity built on hunger. And even as the colony became more profitable, it remained deliberately voiceless. Dutch officials debated whether teaching the locals to read might corrupt their obedience. In 1870, one governor argued in Parliament, to give the natives our language would be to invite our own downfall. He was right, but not in the way he imagined. By the early 1900s, cracks had begun to appear. A new generation of Indonesians, clerks, teachers, and soldiers trained in limited Dutch schools, began to question the system that had kept them silent. They wrote articles, they organized student movements, they dreamed of independence. Ironically, it was Dutch education itself, meant to create loyal servants, that created the first rebels. And when the world changed again in the 20th century, those rebels would be ready. The VOC had collapsed from greed. The Dutch state would collapse from arrogance. And when it did, Indonesia would finally claim the one thing the Dutch could never trade: its identity. In 1942, the world shifted. World War II had reached Asia, and with it came the death of the Dutch Empire. For over 3 centuries, the Netherlands had ruled Indonesia with the confidence of permanence. But in just 3 months, Japanese forces swept across the islands and dismantled everything. Dutch soldiers surrendered by the thousands. Their government fled into exile. And for the first time since the 1600s, Indonesia was free, at least from the Dutch. The Japanese occupation was brutal, but it changed history in ways the Netherlands never intended. Unlike the Dutch, the Japanese didn't rule from behind walls. They walked the streets, spoke to villagers, and, most importantly, used the local language. They banned Dutch in schools, government, and media. For the first time in centuries, the colonial tongue disappeared overnight, and in its place, Bahasa Indonesia became the language of administration, propaganda, and mobilization. Japan's goal wasn't liberation, it was control, but the result was revolutionary. Millions of Indonesians learned to read, write, and think in their own language. A generation raised under silence suddenly found its voice. The occupiers trained Indonesian youth militias, bureaucrats, and police, unknowingly preparing them to run their own nation. And in the underground press, nationalists like Sukarno and Hatta began using Bahasa Indonesia to spread a message that had once been unthinkable. Indonesia belongs to the Indonesians. By 1945, Japan was losing the war. The Americans dropped the atomic bombs and Tokyo surrendered. The power vacuum across Southeast Asia opened overnight. The Dutch expected to return, to reclaim what they saw as theirs, but they came back to a country transformed. On August 17, 1945, just 2 days after Japan's surrender, Sukarno stood before a crowd in Jakarta and read Indonesia's Declaration of Independence, not in Dutch, not in English, but in Bahasa Indonesia. It was the language the Dutch had ignored, the language Japan had legitimized, and now it was the language of freedom. When Dutch forces tried to retake the colony, they found something they could no longer recognize: a nation that could speak for itself. The old methods of control, translators, intermediaries, bureaucracy, no longer worked. The people no longer needed to listen to orders in a foreign tongue. Empires fall for many reasons: war, greed, revolution. But the Dutch Empire in Indonesia fell for something deeper. It lost the monopoly on meaning. For 350 years, the Dutch had ruled without teaching their words. Now, Indonesia used its own to end their rule forever. When Indonesia declared independence in 1945, it didn't just break away from an empire, it broke away from silence. For centuries, the Dutch had spoken over them, around them, and through intermediaries. Now, for the first time, Indonesians spoke for themselves. And they spoke in a language the Dutch had never cared to learn: Bahasa Indonesia. It was a powerful act of psychological rebellion. Every empire seeks to make its subjects speak its tongue, because language is control. To speak in your colonizer's language is to think in their logic. to dream in their words, to define yourself through their definitions. Indonesia refused. Their revolution was fought with rifles and rhetoric alike, pamphlets, declarations, songs, and speeches in the people's own voice. It wasn't eloquent or scholarly. It was real, and it spread faster than any empire ever had. Within just a few years, Bahasa Indonesia became the unifying identity of a nation that had never existed before, a bridge across 700 languages and 17,000 islands, a language not of conquest, but of choice. That choice had enormous symbolic power. In India, English remained after the British left, a legacy of both education and dependence. In North Africa, French still shaped administration, media, and elite culture. But in Indonesia, Dutch disappeared almost entirely. It wasn't erased, it was rejected. The new republic made its stance clear. Dutch was the language of occupation. Bahasa was the language of liberation. And in this decision, Indonesia achieved something most post-colonial nations never did: linguistic independence. Because language is more than communication. It's memory. It's power. It's the architecture of thought. The Dutch had ruled through division, but Bahasa united the islands. They had ruled through hierarchy, but Bahasa leveled it. They had ruled through silence, but Bahasa made the people sing. In schools, it became the medium of instruction. In newspapers, it became the voice of the nation. And in politics, it became the soul of democracy. The irony is poetic. The Dutch tried to avoid sharing their words to preserve their dominance. In doing so, they preserved Indonesia's cultural purity, the one thing no other empire left intact. And so, the story of Dutch Indonesia ends not with language imposed, but with language reclaimed. A reminder that the truest revolutions don't always happen on battlefields. They happen in the mind. They happen every time someone chooses to speak in their own voice, rather than echo the words of their master. When the Dutch finally withdrew from Indonesia in 1949, they left behind the ruins of forts, the bones of plantations, and the ghosts of a vanished empire. But they did not leave behind their voice. Unlike India, Algeria, or the Philippines, Indonesia emerged linguistically untouched. Its streets did not echo with the accent of empire. Its schools did not teach the language of the conqueror. Its people did not dream in Dutch. For 350 years, the Dutch ruled Indonesia as a business. And businesses do not build nations. They extract. They calculate. They profit and depart. The British taught English to make subjects feel civilized. The French taught French to make subjects feel cultured. The Dutch taught nothing, because they didn't want equals. They wanted silence. That silence protected their power for centuries, until it became their undoing. Because silence, too, is a language. It speaks through absence. It unites through resentment. It forces the oppressed to find words of their own. And when Indonesia finally spoke, the world listened. Bahasa Indonesia became more than a tool. It became an act of defiance, a living archive of survival, a language built not on conquest, but on cooperation, not on one island's dialect, but on the idea that every island mattered. Today, Indonesia is one of the most linguistically diverse nations on Earth, yet united by a single national tongue, chosen by its people, not imposed by its masters. That unity is not just political, it's spiritual. It says, "We are many, but we speak as one." And that's the great irony of Dutch colonization. They ruled longer than the British ruled India. They exploited more efficiently than the French in Africa. But they never understood the simplest truth, that language is the soul of empire. Empires don't last because of armies or trade routes. They last because people believe in their story. And when you never bother to teach that story, no one remembers it. So the Dutch Empire ended the way it lived, profitably, efficiently, and quietly. It conquered with ledgers, not with words. And when those ledgers closed, its empire vanished, leaving behind a nation that could finally speak for itself. 3 centuries of rule, and not a single word remained, because the language of power fades, but the voice of the people never does. In the end, the Dutch left with their spices. Indonesia kept its voice.